The gunshot cracked through the air, its sharp echo reverberating across the field. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as the sound cut through the stillness of the afternoon. It didn't register at first. Was it thunder? A car backfiring? But then I heard it again, the desperate bleating of my goat, followed by the sickening thud of her body hitting the ground. I ran, my legs pushing me faster than I thought possible, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I reached the corner of the barn, my heart racing, only to see her lying in the dirt, her body still, her eyes wide with shock. The sight of her blood staining the earth made my stomach twist. She was gone. I sank to my knees beside her, my hands trembling as I tried to shake her, hoping that somehow, this was all a terrible mistake, a bad dream. But there was no denying it. She was dead. And standing at the far end of the field, watching us with an unreadable expression, was Karen, the woman who had made my life a nightmare for far too long. "You've got some nerve, Karen," I called out, my voice thick with disbelief and fury. "What the hell did you do?" Her eyes flicked to me, cold and calculating, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "I did what needed to be done," she replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "She was a nuisance. You should have known better than to keep her here." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen had always been trouble, dictating rules, imposing her views, making it impossible to live peacefully. But this? This was beyond anything I could have imagined. She'd shot my goat. And now, she was standing there, blaming me for it, as though she had every right. "Why?" I demanded, my hands clenching into fists. "Why did you do this?" But Karen didn't answer. Instead, she walked away, turning her back on the scene she had created, as if nothing had happened, as if this was just another day in her twisted world. I was left kneeling in the dirt, my heart shattered. What had just happened? And why did she do this? This wasn't just a random act, it was a declaration, a final straw that would lead to a confrontation I never expected. The conflict with Karen had been brewing for months, like a storm on the horizon, slowly gathering strength before finally breaking. At first, it was small things, comments here and there about how my farm wasn't up to her standards. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, in the neighborhood, and everyone knew she liked to control everything. Karen seemed to think she had the right to dictate what went on in everyone's lives, even if it meant stepping on toes to do it. It started with my goats. They were my pride and joy, the one thing on this farm that truly brought me peace. I had a small herd, nothing fancy, just enough to keep me busy and give me fresh milk. Karen, however, didn't see it that way. She didn't like the noise they made. She didn't like the smell of their hay wafting over to her perfect, immaculate lawn. She didn't like the idea of any farm animals in a well-maintained community. The first complaint came when she knocked on my door one morning, her voice dripping with authority. "You're running a farm, not a petting zoo," she told me, her face a mask of disapproval. "This is a residential area. It's not meant for livestock. The HOA board is getting numerous complaints about the noise and smell. You need to get rid of them." I stood there, shocked. Karen had never spoken to me like this before. And to say it in front of my children? It was completely out of line. I tried to reason with her, explaining that my goats were no different than the dogs or the birds people kept in the neighborhood. But Karen was having none of it. "I don't care," she said, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "They don't belong here. You have 2 weeks to find another home for them, or I'll have to take it to the board." I was furious, of course. But I did what I could to avoid trouble. I talked to the board, tried to negotiate a compromise. I agreed to move my goats into a smaller, more secluded area of my property to minimize the noise and smell. I thought that would settle things. I thought Karen would be satisfied. But she wasn't. Over the next few weeks, she increased the pressure. I received letters from the HOA threatening fines. She called animal control, even though my goats were healthy and well cared for. Then, Karen went a step further. She started trying to get my neighbors involved, telling them that I was violating HOA rules and threatening them with fines if they didn't back her up. Her influence was growing, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. But nothing prepared me for the day Karen took matters into her own hands. It was an unusually warm afternoon when I saw Karen standing at the edge of my property, just beyond the fence where my goats roamed. I was in the barn, mucking out some hay, when I heard the sound of a gunshot. It rang out, sharp and clear in the otherwise quiet afternoon. My heart dropped as I turned toward the sound. I ran out of the barn, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel the panic rising in my chest. And then I saw it, my goat, the one I'd raised since she was a kid, lying in the dirt, blood soaking into the ground. Karen was standing over her, the rifle still in her hands, her face eerily calm. "You've got some nerve, Karen," I shouted, stumbling toward her. My body was shaking, and my mind was reeling. "What the hell did you do?" She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at me when she spoke. She was a nuisance. She was making noise again. "You should have taken care of it before." "I had to do it for you," she said, her tone cold, almost mechanical. I couldn't process her words. They didn't make sense. This wasn't just a random accident. Karen had shot my goat on purpose. She had crossed a line, one I never thought she would dare to cross. She wasn't just making demands anymore, she was taking action, and she was doing it in the most violent way possible. My body went cold as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "You shot her," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You shot my goat." "Why? For what? Because she was too loud? Because she existed?" Karen finally looked at me then, her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a slight smirk. "It's not about the goat," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "It's about you. You think you can just do whatever you want, break the rules, and ignore the HOA? No one gets away with that, not in my neighborhood." I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't just about a goat or noise or some petty disagreement. This was about control. Karen wanted to dictate everything, everything that happened on this property, everything that happened in this neighborhood. She had used every tool at her disposal, complaints, letters, threats, but now, it seemed, she had chosen to escalate things to a new level. I couldn't believe it. The truth was settling in, sharp and hard. Karen wasn't going to stop until she got her way, no matter the cost. And now, she had taken the one thing that had meant the most to me. My heart was racing as I stared at her, the rifle still in her hands, the tension between us growing thicker by the second. She had pushed me too far. There was no going back now. I couldn't let this slide. This was my home, my animals, my life. I had to stop her, even if I didn't know how. My goat, Maggie, wasn't just an animal to me, she was family. I'd raised her from the time she was just a few days old, a tiny, curious kid with big, wide eyes and a coat that was soft as velvet. From the moment I first held her, I knew she was special. She wasn't just one of my farm animals, she had a personality that shone through in everything she did. Maggie was a constant presence in my life, always by my side in the field, nibbling on hay or nudging me gently with her head when she wanted attention. Her companionship was simple, but it brought me peace. There was a quiet comfort in knowing that she was there, and I couldn't imagine a day without her. Maggie wasn't just a pet, she was also part of my livelihood. I used her milk for cheese and butter, both of which I sold at the local farmer's market. Over time, I had come to depend on her not just for the income she provided but for the way she had woven herself into the fabric of my daily routine. I would spend hours cleaning her pen, talking to her as I worked, and watching her interact with the other animals on the farm. She was always a bit of a leader, her head held high as she moved among the herd, guiding them with quiet authority. But Maggie wasn't just an animal to me, she had a way of calming the stresses of the day. Whether it was her soft bleat or the way she'd nudge me when I was upset, Maggie had a way of making everything feel a little less overwhelming. Her eyes, so trusting and innocent, reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, even when it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. As much as I loved her, I could never have anticipated the trouble that Karen would bring into our lives. Karen wasn't just the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she was the self-appointed savior of the neighborhood. She'd been in charge for years, and she took her role far too seriously. Karen was the kind of person who believed that the world should bend to her will. She had this uncanny ability to make everyone feel like they were breaking the rules, even when they weren't. If there was a lawn that wasn't perfectly manicured or a neighbor with a slightly too loud dog, she'd be there, clipboard in hand, making complaints to the board. When I first moved to the area, I didn't think much of Karen. She seemed friendly enough at first, always popping in with a smile, talking about the rules of the neighborhood, and offering unsolicited advice on how to improve my property. I was new to the area, so I tried to keep the peace, listening politely while nodding along to her long-winded explanations. But it didn't take long for me to notice the way Karen would stare at my animals, her nose wrinkling slightly in distaste whenever she walked by the pasture. I had goats, chickens, and a couple of cows, and I noticed that the more animals I had, the more frequently Karen found reasons to knock on my door. At first, it was just the usual complaint about the noise. "Your goats are bleeding too much," she'd say. "It's disturbing the neighbors. You really should consider getting rid of them." At first, I tried to be understanding, hoping to avoid conflict. I moved the goats to the back pasture, away from Karen's house, thinking that would solve the problem. But she didn't stop. Every few days, another complaint would arrive: "Your chickens are making a mess," or "There's too much hay on your property, it looks unsightly." It wasn't just about the goats anymore, it was about me. Karen had begun to find faults in every corner of my life, in my home, in the way I kept my animals, even in the way I chose to live. But it wasn't until Karen started making threats that I realized how far she was willing to go to control everything around her. It all came to a head when I received an official letter from the HOA, signed by Karen herself. She was demanding that I get rid of my goats, claiming that they violated neighborhood rules about livestock in residential areas. But Karen wasn't content to simply send a letter. She began to show up unannounced, making her way onto my property, telling me that she had the right to inspect my land. When I refused, she threatened to involve animal control, telling me that if I didn't comply, she would have my animals taken away. It was clear that she saw herself as the law in this neighborhood, and nothing I did would ever be good enough for her. As the pressure mounted, I began to feel cornered. Karen's threats were relentless, and I couldn't afford to lose my goats. Not only were they a part of my livelihood, but they were a part of my life. I loved them, and I wasn't about to let Karen take them from me. But every time I tried to stand up for myself, Karen would escalate things. She enlisted the help of other neighbors, making them believe that I was somehow breaking the law, that my goats were a menace to the neighborhood. I started to lose friends, people who had once been kind neighbors, all because Karen had manipulated the situation to her advantage. The tension between Karen and me grew as she found new ways to make my life difficult. It was a war of attrition, small battles that seemed to have no end, with Karen slowly wearing me down with her constant demands. It wasn't just about the goats anymore, it was about control. Karen wanted to run the neighborhood, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. And every time I stood up to her, every time I pushed back, it only made her more determined to break me. But no one could have prepared me for the day she took matters into her own hands. The moment she crossed the line and shot Maggie. It wasn't just a crime against an animal, it was an attack on everything I had worked for, everything I loved. Karen's true nature had finally been revealed, and I knew then that she wouldn't stop until she had completely destroyed what I had built. Now, standing over Maggie's lifeless body, I realized that this wasn't just about goats or complaints, it was a battle for my life, my home, my peace. And Karen had just escalated it to something far darker than I ever could have imagined. My mind raced as I stood there, staring at Maggie's lifeless body, the shock of what had just happened still settling in. The sound of the gunshot still rang in my ears, the high-pitched screech of the shot reverberating through my mind, refusing to fade. I felt numb, unsure of what to do next, but as I turned towards Karen, her cold gaze met mine, and I knew everything was about to spiral even further out of control. "Karen, what the hell did you do?" I yelled, stepping toward her, my anger bubbling over. My hands clenched into fists as I tried to suppress the overwhelming surge of emotion. "You shot her. You killed my goat." Karen didn't flinch. She didn't even seem startled by my outburst. She stood there, the rifle still in her hands, her eyes cold, almost indifferent to the destruction she had caused. "It was necessary," she said, her voice calm, as though she was explaining something completely rational. "She was disturbing the neighborhood. Your whole farm is a nuisance. I gave you more than enough chances to fix it, but you didn't listen. This is your fault, not mine." The words hit me like a slap. This is your fault? How could she even say that? I was too stunned to speak for a moment, my breath coming in short gasps. Karen had killed my goat, and now, she was trying to turn the blame onto me. The audacity of her actions was almost too much to bear. "You're seriously blaming me?" I managed to choke out. "You had no right to do this. You could have talked to me, had a conversation like an adult, but no. You shot her. And now you're trying to say it's my fault?" Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a cold smile. "You don't understand, do you? I've tried to be reasonable. But you've ignored every warning, every request. You've made it impossible for me to live peacefully here. You've made the whole neighborhood uncomfortable, and I couldn't let it go on any longer. I did what had to be done." I stood there, struggling to comprehend her twisted logic. Karen wasn't sorry. She didn't regret what she had done. In her mind, she had done me a favor, cleaning up what she saw as my mess. She was the one in control, and no amount of reasoning or pleading could change that. As I stood there, shaking with anger, I saw her glance at the ground beside Maggie's body. Without warning, she dropped the rifle to her side and began moving toward the barn. "What are you doing?" I shouted, feeling a sudden panic rise in me. She didn't look back as she answered. "I'm doing what should have been done from the start. I'm burying the goat." I didn't know how to respond. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a few tentative steps forward, watching as Karen began to dig a hole near the back of the barn, clearly determined to dispose of Maggie's body as quickly as possible. She moved with methodical precision, the shovel cutting into the earth with disturbing ease. "No," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You're not burying her. You can't just hide what you've done." Karen shot me a quick glance, the same cold, calculating look she had given me when she shot the goat. "I'm not hiding anything," she said in a clipped tone. "I'm getting rid of the evidence. You don't want to deal with this, do you? It's better for everyone if we just move on." She was trying to cover it up. She was trying to erase the evidence of her crime, to make it disappear as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I rushed forward, grabbing the shovel from her hands, feeling the heat of my anger flare up again. "Don't you dare," I hissed, my grip tight around the handle. "You think you can just bury this and pretend it never happened? I'm not letting you. You'll pay for what you've done." Karen took a step back, her eyes flashing with anger. "You don't have the right to tell me what to do. You're the one who's caused all of this. You brought this on yourself." I stood there, struggling to keep my composure, feeling the weight of the moment settle on me. She had pushed me too far. My goat was dead, and now she was trying to bury the evidence of her crime as if it was nothing. I couldn't let it happen. "Get off my property, Karen," I said, my voice firm but shaky with emotion. You don't get to control this anymore. You don't get to do whatever you want without consequences. At that moment, I saw something change in Karen's expression. Her smugness, the air of superiority she had carried with her for so long, began to slip away. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or recognition that she had underestimated me. But it didn't last long. She squared her shoulders, her chin lifting with defiance. "You think you can stop me?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "You're nothing but a nuisance. You'll see. I'll have the law on my side. I've got more power than you'll ever have." Before I could respond, I heard the sound of a car approaching. Karen turned quickly, her eyes narrowing as she saw the headlights cutting through the darkening sky. The car screeched to a halt in front of the barn, and two neighbors, people I had thought were on Karen's side, stepped out of the car. "What's going on here?" one of them, Linda, called out, looking at the scene with confusion. Her gaze moved from Karen, standing with the shovel, to me, standing over Maggie's body. Karen wasted no time. She quickly spun the situation in her favor, explaining that I was the one who had caused trouble, that I had refused to comply with the HOA's requests, and that my goats had been a constant issue for everyone. She painted me as the villain, the one who had pushed her to this point. But I wasn't going to let her twist the truth any longer. "She shot my goat, Linda. She killed her. And now she's trying to bury the evidence." Linda's face softened as she looked at the body of the goat, and she glanced back at Karen with suspicion. The tension in the air was palpable as the other neighbor, Tom, stepped forward. "You shot her?" he asked, his voice quiet but incredulous. "Karen, is that true?" For a moment, Karen hesitated. Her calm demeanor cracked just enough for me to see the panic flicker in her eyes. But then she composed herself, her voice cold and controlled. "It was necessary. You know it was." She was disturbing the peace. The scene was spiraling out of control, and I knew we couldn't let Karen escape unscathed. I could feel the walls closing in, but this time, I wouldn't back down. Not again. Not with Maggie's death on the line. As the neighbors began to question Karen, I knew the conflict was about to escalate. This wasn't just about a goat anymore, this was about standing up to Karen, and exposing the lengths she would go to in order to maintain control. The battle was only beginning. The hours that followed Karen's attempt to bury the truth felt like a blur. The neighbors, Linda and Tom, were both visibly shaken, unsure of what to believe. Karen's words came out like a well-rehearsed script, calm, cold, and full of authority. She painted herself as the savior of the neighborhood, the one who was simply taking action to maintain peace, and she managed to convince them, for the most part. It was clear that Karen had a hold on people in this neighborhood, and she knew how to manipulate her power. As the neighbors argued over the validity of Karen's story, I stood in the background, seething with frustration. It was like watching a well-oiled machine in action. Karen knew exactly what she was doing, using her influence to spin the situation in her favor. She was a master manipulator, capable of turning even the most absurd story into something that seemed plausible. She was doing what she had always done, twisting the truth to fit her narrative and making everyone else seem like the problem. But as I watched her, a realization hit me. Karen wasn't just a troublemaker. She wasn't just a petty HOA president with too much time on her hands. She was something much more dangerous. Karen had no sense of empathy or remorse for the destruction she caused. She wasn't just interested in enforcing the rules, she was interested in control. She enjoyed watching people bend to her will, seeing how far she could push before someone broke. The thought made my blood boil. She had crossed a line when she shot Maggie, and the more I thought about it, the more I understood the magnitude of what had happened. It wasn't just about a goat. It wasn't just about some petty complaints anymore. Karen had taken it upon herself to make sure I paid for daring to live my life the way I saw fit. She had taken something precious from me, and I couldn't let that go. I couldn't just sit back and let her walk away from this. As the evening wore on, I found myself pacing in the barn, trying to sort through my thoughts. I had been trying to do the right thing, working with the HOA, keeping the peace, moving the goats to another part of the property, but Karen wasn't interested in peace. She wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted to break me, and she wanted everyone around her to see her as the ultimate authority. I couldn't let that happen. Not to me, and certainly not to anyone else she had targeted. But how could I fight back? Karen had all the power. She had the HOA on her side, and she had the ability to manipulate people with ease. She had already made it clear that she wasn't afraid to escalate things, and she was well connected enough to make my life hell if I pushed back too hard. But then it occurred to me, I didn't have to fight her alone. Karen was used to isolating her targets, turning people against them, but I wasn't isolated. I had neighbors who could see through her lies, neighbors like Linda and Tom, and I needed to reach out to them. I needed to show them the truth. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to let Karen's manipulation and lies control my life any longer. I couldn't let her get away with this. It was time to take action, real, decisive action. The first step was getting the evidence. I needed to prove that Karen had shot Maggie, and I needed to expose her for what she was, a bully, a liar, and someone who would stop at nothing to get her way. I had to collect the facts, document the events as they had unfolded, and rally my neighbors to my side. But I also needed to be smart about it. Karen was shrewd. She wouldn't back down easily, and if I made the wrong move, I risked giving her the upper hand. I had to think strategically, stay calm, and make sure that every step I took was calculated and deliberate. The realization was clear, the time for passive resistance was over. Karen had made it personal. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now, it was time for me to stand up, not just for myself, but for anyone who had ever been pushed around by her. I walked back to the house, my resolve hardening. It was time to fight. And this time, I wasn't going to lose. The next few days felt like a countdown. I could feel the tension hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't backing down, and neither was I. I had spent every moment since the shooting documenting everything, taking photos of the scene, collecting witness statements from Linda and Tom, and making sure that everything was in order for the showdown I knew was coming. The truth couldn't stay buried any longer. I wasn't going to let Karen twist the narrative anymore. I could already hear her voice in my head, calm and cold as she spun her lies, the same story she had told to the neighbors. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. The goats were a nuisance, and she wouldn't listen to reason. It was a familiar tune, one she'd been playing for months. But this time, the stakes were different. Karen had crossed a line when she shot Maggie, and now I was going to make sure she faced the consequences. The morning of the confrontation, I stood outside, taking in the peaceful scene around me. The sun was rising, casting a soft golden glow over the land. Maggie's grave was still fresh, a painful reminder of what had been stolen from me. But I wasn't going to let grief paralyze me. I had a plan. I had to follow through, no matter what. I walked to Karen's house, feeling a surge of determination with every step. I wasn't just walking over to her to ask questions or plead for forgiveness, I was going to confront her, to demand accountability for what she had done. She had pushed me to the edge, and now I was ready to take back control. When I knocked on her door, I wasn't surprised when she opened it with that smug look on her face, like she knew she was in charge of the neighborhood and everyone around her. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me standing there, but she didn't say anything right away. "Well, well, well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What brings you to my doorstep?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I had prepared for. "We need to talk," I said firmly. "You've taken things too far, and I'm not going to stand by while you get away with it." She raised an eyebrow, playing the part of the calm, collected woman who thought she had everything under control. Taken things too far? I think you're overreacting. You've been nothing but a headache for me from the start, and I've had to make the tough decisions. Tough decisions? I repeated, stepping closer. You killed my goat, Karen. You shot her in cold blood, and now you're trying to bury the truth. You can't just erase what you've done. Her face darkened, the smugness slipping away, replaced by a flash of anger. She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes hardening. You don't understand, she said through gritted teeth. You never have. I've been trying to save this neighborhood from your chaos. I've been trying to make things better, and you've been nothing but a disruption. The goats, the noise, the mess, it all had to stop. I shook my head. You didn't do any of this to help the neighborhood, Karen. You did it for control. You wanted to force everyone to live by your rules, and when I didn't comply, you decided to take matters into your own hands. You didn't just shoot Maggie, you tried to make it disappear. Her gaze faltered for a moment, a brief flicker of doubt in her eyes, but she quickly regained her composure. I did what needed to be done. It's not like you were going to do anything about it. I stepped forward, my voice rising with each word. I'm doing something about it now, Karen. You think you can just control everyone around you, intimidate them, and get away with it? Not this time. She flinched at the mention of her control, but before she could say anything more, Linda and Tom appeared on the front porch, having heard the commotion. Linda's eyes were wide with uncertainty, and Tom looked like he had come to back me up, though he wasn't sure how this was going to play out. We've heard enough, Linda said, her voice steady but unsure. Karen, we need to know the truth. Karen's face flushed with frustration, her jaw tightening. She looked at Linda and Tom, her expression hardening as she tried to regain control of the situation. This is none of your business, she spat. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. You don't know what it's like to try to keep order in a place like this. But her, she pointed at me, has caused nothing but chaos. She's the one who's made this neighborhood unbearable. I think we all need to hear what really happened, Tom interjected, stepping forward. You killed her goat, didn't you, Karen? For a moment, the air hung heavy, thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Karen's expression twisted as she fought to maintain her composure, but the cracks were becoming visible. The mask she had worn for so long was slipping. You're not going to win this, Karen, I said, my voice unwavering. You may have manipulated people for years, but not this time. We've got proof. We've got photos, witness statements, everything we need to expose the truth. And you're not getting away with this. For a brief moment, Karen's eyes flickered with fear. But she quickly masked it with anger, taking a step back. You don't know what you're up against, she hissed. I'll make sure you regret this. You can't fight me. But her words lacked conviction now. Karen's foundation, the one she had built on manipulation and intimidation, was crumbling. The truth was out, and her control was slipping through her fingers. I'm done being afraid of you, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. You've hurt enough people. You're not going to hurt anyone else. The authorities arrived shortly after, summoned by Linda and Tom, who had witnessed enough to know that Karen was in the wrong. Karen tried to explain her actions, but it was clear she had no defense that could hold up. The truth had come out, and now Karen was facing the consequences of her actions. No amount of manipulation or power could save her now. As I watched Karen being led away by the officers, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't over, not completely. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had taken control of my life back. The battle with Karen was over, and I had won. The days after the confrontation felt like a strange kind of limbo. Karen had been escorted off the property by the authorities, her rifle confiscated, and the threat she had posed to my life and my animals was finally over. But even as I stood there, watching her retreating figure disappear into the back of the police car, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had just transpired. The shock of what had happened, the anger, the betrayal, the sense of violation, was still fresh in my mind. But something else lingered too, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge, the sense of relief. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. Yet, the fallout from Karen's actions wasn't as clean-cut as I had hoped. Karen wasn't the type of person to take defeat quietly. She had spent years cultivating an image of herself as the neighborhood authority, the person everyone turned to for advice, for order. Karen wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of scrutiny or judgment. In the days that followed, I began to hear rumors. It started with whispers from Linda and Tom, both of whom had stood by me during the confrontation. They told me that Karen had begun her campaign of damage control almost immediately. She'd been in contact with the HOA board, trying to explain herself, trying to paint herself as a misunderstood hero. She told them that she was simply defending the peace of the community, and that I had provoked her by ignoring the rules for so long. In a way, it was the same old Karen, always turning the narrative around, always casting herself as the victim. But this time, people were starting to see through it. Her manipulation wasn't working the way it used to. Neighbors who had once followed her blindly began questioning her version of events. There were talks of a formal investigation, and Karen's once unshakable hold on the neighborhood was slowly eroding. People began reaching out to me, expressing their support and telling me they were glad I had stood up for myself. The tide was turning, and it was clear Karen no longer held the power she once had. Still, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. I could see it in the way she tried to paint me as a troublemaker to anyone who would listen. But I wasn't going to let her drag me through the mud again. I had kept a record of everything, every conversation, every complaint, every letter she'd sent, and every action she'd taken to undermine me. It was all there, ready to be presented if she tried to escalate things further. And yet, despite her best efforts, Karen's reputation was starting to crumble. The HOA board had no choice but to launch a formal review into her actions. Neighbors who had once felt powerless against her now began speaking out about her overreach and how she had manipulated situations to get her way. It was a long, drawn-out process, but Karen was finally starting to lose her grip on the community. For me, however, the battle was not just about Karen. It was about reclaiming my own sense of peace. For so long, I had been at the mercy of her whims, constantly walking on eggshells, afraid of making her angry, afraid of what she might do next. The incident with Maggie had forced me to confront the reality that I had been letting someone like Karen control my life for too long. The next few weeks were a period of reflection and healing. I spent more time at the barn, cleaning out the stalls and tending to the animals, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of my daily tasks. Maggie was gone, and there would always be a hole in my heart where she used to be. But I found solace in the other animals, the goats, the chickens, the cows, who depended on me, and I realized that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. It wasn't just the animals that needed healing. The community, too, was recovering from the division that Karen had sowed. Linda and Tom became more than just neighbors, they became friends. I invited them over for dinner one evening, and as we sat around the table, laughing and talking about everything except Karen, I realized how much I had been missing out on. We had all been caught in Karen's web, but now we were free to reconnect, to build a new kind of relationship, one based on trust, not fear. Even the other neighbors who had stayed silent during Karen's reign began to open up. One by one, they reached out to me, offering apologies for not standing up sooner, and expressing their support. It wasn't easy, but there was a sense of healing in the air, like the neighborhood was finally starting to remember what it was supposed to be, a community. We were all in this together, and we weren't going to let Karen tear us apart anymore. Despite the progress, I knew the scars of the past would linger. Karen's influence had been deep, and her actions had left an imprint on the way we all viewed each other. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the real healing had already begun. It wasn't in the apology from Karen, which I knew would never come, it wasn't in the legal victory or the community's newfound unity. It was in the way I had taken back my life. I had stood up to Karen, and that was something I would never forget. The healing process was slow, but it was happening. As I looked out over the land, the sun setting on a peaceful evening, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Karen's chapter in my life was finally closing, and I was ready to move forward. Maggie may have been gone, but the strength I had gained from that loss would stay with me, helping me face whatever challenges lay ahead. The battle was over, but the community was stronger, and I was, too. The resolution came slowly, like the soft light of dawn after a long, dark night. After Karen's defeat, the fallout was inevitable. The community, once so divided under her influence, began to heal, piece by piece. The neighbors who had once feared Karen's wrath were finally able to speak up, to share their experiences, and to support one another. As for Karen, her power was stripped away bit by bit. The HOA board, after their investigation, voted to remove her from her position as president. The very thing Karen had clung to for years, the control she had exercised over the neighborhood, was gone. But it didn't end there. After Karen's removal, the local authorities took a closer look at the shooting of Maggie. Thanks to the evidence I had collected, the photos, the witness statements, and the documentation, Karen couldn't hide behind her lies any longer. The charges weren't just about killing an animal. They were about the misuse of power, the unlawful destruction of someone's property, and the emotional distress caused to me and my family. In the end, Karen was fined, and though the legal system was slow and cumbersome, she faced the consequences of her actions. The shame of it all lingered longer than any punishment she received, though. Karen had tried to manipulate her way out of responsibility, but she had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. Still, even as Karen faced the consequences, I couldn't bring myself to feel satisfaction. What had happened to Maggie could never be undone, and the bitterness of her death lingered in the pit of my stomach. But with Karen no longer a threat, I was free to focus on rebuilding, to focus on what really mattered. The pain of losing Maggie would never fully go away, but in a strange way, her memory had become a source of strength for me. I built a small memorial for her near the barn where she had spent most of her life. I placed flowers and a small stone with her name engraved on it, a tribute to the goat who had been more than just an animal to me. As I stood there, looking out over the field, I felt a sense of peace begin to settle in my heart. The truth had come out. Karen's reign of fear was over, and in its place was a community that had begun to remember what it was like to stand together. Linda, Tom, and the others who had supported me now came together regularly, sharing meals, laughing, and living without the constant fear of Karen's interference. We rebuilt the neighborhood with a stronger sense of unity, one that didn't rely on the power of one person to dictate the rules. For me, the lessons were clear. Karen had shown me how far a person could go when they were driven by control and manipulation. But she had also shown me that even the most powerful person could fall when the truth was on your side. I had learned not to back down, not to let anyone intimidate me into silence. In facing Karen, I had learned the true value of standing up for myself, even when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable. As the days passed, I felt the weight of what had happened slowly lift. Maggie was gone, but the strength she had given me remained. The community had come together, and we were stronger for it. And though there was still a piece of me that would forever miss her, I knew that life would continue, and that I had the power to shape it from this point on. The story of Karen and Maggie had come to its close, but it wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, a chance to live without fear, to rebuild what had been torn apart, and to honor the memory of the goat that had reminded me of the importance of standing strong. Karen may have taken Maggie from me, but she hadn't taken my spirit, and that was something she could never control. And for that, I would always be grateful to Maggie, whose loss had taught me the power of standing up for what I believed in.